Okie dokie. I believe this is working. Let me just make sure I'm centered and everything. Alrighty, I think we're good to go here. So, hello everyone. Hope you're doing very, very well. Azren, the language nerd here, as per usual. We are doing yet another Azren's Journal. This is episode number 30. Excited to be doing this. For those of you who have never seen an Azren's Journal before, it is pretty straightforward. This is basically the segment on my YouTube channel where I share my personal language learning journey, and of course a segment where I give you guys a whole bunch of language learning tips. So welcome to some of the live viewers. I just saw a couple people, or actually one person who just hopped on, and I'm sure we'll get more as we go. So I want to kick things off. With some personal language learning updates. So for the people who follow this channel, you probably know that I was in Taiwan for 5 weeks, and then I was in France for 2 weeks very, very recently. And so for basically those 7 weeks, I was in intensive language learning mode. I was doing a lot of French, and of course, naturally, because I was in Taiwan, I was doing a whole bunch of Mandarin. And I thought the time was ripe to give a little bit of an update here, because I've been back in Canada for, I'm just looking at the calendar, about, I would say almost about 2 weeks now, approximately 2 or 3 weeks even. I've been back in Canada. And I know that for a lot of people, one of the obvious questions to ask is, how are you managing to continue your studies and keep going with things after an intensive experience? If you've never actually done an intensive study of a language before, it might be difficult to imagine, but try to follow me here. Imagine studying your target language, whether it's French or Japanese or English or Spanish or Mandarin or whatever it is, right? German or whatever language. Imagine studying that intensively. And that's basically all you did for, 1 month or 2 months, something like that. And now suddenly you're back in your day-to-day life. I think you could probably imagine it can be a little bit of a difficult transition, and it's hard to figure out how are you continuing to do your language studies. So I thought I would share some of my personal experience. I think so far myself, I'm not doing the greatest of jobs, to be perfectly honest. I am focusing a lot more on my work, on teaching, on content stuff like YouTube videos and podcasts, things like that. And to be honest, I'm not doing a fantastic job of maintaining the Mandarin that I learned and that I was doing while I was in Taiwan, to be honest. I'm doing okay. There are certain things I'm doing. So for example, once a week, I host an event for Mandarin learners. And basically, you could think of it like a beginner conversation lesson. So we play some games, we do some activities, I teach some basic Mandarin. So that's obviously good. I have one of my teachers in Taiwan, we've set up a little bit of a language exchange once a week for us to do. I've been doing a little bit of reading practice. I think reading practice is a good thing. But, aside from those, I'm not doing anything crazy at the moment. I'm just doing some pretty part-time, on the side kind of studies. And I think this is a good learning point. You can probably learn from my personal experience here. I think most people, when they're learning a language, 90%, 95%, whatever, the majority of people when they're learning a language, it's something that's on the side. You have a full-time job, maybe you're a full-time student, maybe you have something. You have something that occupies the majority of your time. And then you probably have some other commitments and hobbies and such as well. So language learning is probably something you focus on a couple hours a week, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. Like, it's not something that is an all-encompassing part of your life. Most likely, for most language learners, that is the case. And when you're in that situation, I think it's important to understand that if you want to achieve a high level of fluency, even an average level of fluency, even if you're like, okay, I want to become reasonably conversational, something like my current Mandarin level. I'm kind of like a middle B1 level, or close to kind of around an HSK4 in Mandarin, if you understand the HSK scale. I'm pretty average. I'm not fantastic. I have good pronunciation, which is good, and that's fantastic. But I'm not fantastic at the language, and it's taken me 5 years. 5 years of, if we were to average out the amount of hours I've done, it's probably like a reasonable few hours a week. I've done 3 months in China, which was very intensive. I've now done 6 weeks in Taiwan, which is very intensive. Aside from that, most of my studies have either been non-existent, like I'm just not doing anything I'm just not doing any study every week, or it's been very casual. So it's taken 5 years, five years to get to a point where I'm like reasonably conversational. And this ties into the very first question that I want to talk about in this episode of Azren's Journal. I'm going to pull it out on my phone right now. I've got a couple of questions that we're going to be discussing in today's video. The first one here comes from Instagram, and it's basically in relation to what I just said, how it's taken me 5 years to achieve a semi-conversational level in Mandarin. And the question is as follows. I'll paraphrase a little bit. It comes from the username on Instagram is at 95, like the numbers, 95_7heaven. Okay. She says, how can people end up being really fluent in so many languages when it takes 4 or 5 years to even achieve a semi-conversational level in one language? Like, are certain polyglots practicing 2 languages at a time? Are they studying vocabulary in multiple languages? Like, what are they doing? Attached to this message here, she also sent me a video of, what's his name? Luca. What's that Italian guy's name? Like Luca. I think he's Italian. Who's that polyglot? His first name is Luca. I always forget his last name. It's a video of him and one other individual, and they're speaking in various languages. So she's attached that video to this message. Okay. Now, in terms of Tessa's question here in the live chat, when you're referencing intensive study, I assume you mean more than just an increased amount of hours in study. Let me get to that, Tessa. I'm going to respond to this question I just talked about. Then I'm going to answer your question here, Tessa. Give me like 4 minutes. So to answer 95.7 Heaven's question, I think there's a lot to dissect. I think people who are really strong in a high number of languages, let's say 5 languages, 6 languages, there's different factors to look at. Number one, how many languages did they grow up with? That's an important one. How many languages did they start learning at a younger age? That's a good starting point. Maybe the answer is 0. Maybe it was like English was the only thing, or they grew up with 1 language. Maybe. But maybe they're like me. I grew up with 3. I immediately have an advantage over a lot of people. I grew up with English, with French, and Gujarati from a very young age. Even Spanish, really, I started at the age of like 16. So even that is a reasonably young age to start a language. So immediately it's 4 languages starting at a very young age. So you got to start there, okay? I think another thing to look at is, how are you defining really fluent? What is your definition of, oh, this person is really, really fluent in blah, 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 blah language? What is your definition of that? Because for you, if we had a Mandarin speaker right beside me here, and we just started to talk, we could probably talk for an hour and a half. And I would have to minimally look up words in the dictionary. I would struggle sometimes. I would make some mistakes. Like, it wouldn't be perfect, but generally speaking, we would not have a crazy difficult time speaking for approximately an hour, 2 hours, anything like that. So for you, if you speak no Mandarin, you might think, wow, Azren is really fluent in Mandarin. Holy cow. But it's only because I'm better than you. It's only because compared to you, comparatively, I'm a lot more fluent than you. Does that make sense? So it's not that I'm really fluent in Mandarin. It's just that from your perspective, I'm really, really fluent in Mandarin. That's all it is. So I think sometimes we have to keep that in perspective, is how fluent is the person we're really looking at? Perhaps, maybe, the person we looked at, whoever Luca or whoever we're looking at, perhaps they're conversational in 8 languages, or 5 or 7 or 10 or whatever. Maybe they're like good in a certain number of languages, but they're not really, it's not like speaking their mother tongue. It's not like speaking their first language. I think another thing to look at is this natural, not natural, I mean, yes, talent for sure, like how much natural skill set someone has. The reality is some people might just find it easier than others to pick up a new language. That is a reality of language learning, the same way that, who knows, someone might find it easier to play a sport than me, or someone might find it easier to do mathematics than I do, or whatever it is. There's different things. We all have different skill sets and preferences and blah, 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 blah. And then lastly, you have to look at, what someone's lifestyle looks like. Someone, you might have a lifestyle that makes it more difficult for you to acquire language compared to someone who finds it easier. Let's say someone was born in Europe and they grew up traveling around to different European countries, and they had exposure to different European languages, versus you grew up in small town Alberta, which is a province where I live, or small town wherever, right, in somewhere in America or whatever. You might not have had much exposure to other languages or things like that, and didn't really have a lot of practice with it, nor currently do you have a lot of stuff around you to be able to practice different languages and do things. Obviously, the internet makes it a lot easier now, which is fantastic. But so there's a lot of factors to look at. And, I think for me, when I look at myself, when I say 5 years to have achieved some kind of conversational level in Mandarin, I probably could have gotten there faster. But I'm a little bit of a perfectionist when it comes to learning other languages, because my personal goals in another language are to achieve a level that is similar to my level of English, similar to my mother tongue, similar to a native speaker. And for me to do that, the way that I like to do it is I will be a little bit of a perfectionist in terms of making sure I know the grammar, making sure I'm learning a lot of vocabulary, really moving slowly per se, going deep with the language. Because I just don't, for me, it's not just about getting the message across or anything like that. There's more to it than that, at least for me, for Azren personally. So hopefully that question is taken care of. Let's go to Tessa's question here. So I'll read the question out. Tessa says, when you were referencing intensive study, I assume you mean more than just an increase in hours of study / exposure. Yeah, I think so. So I think for me, when I talk about an intensive study, I think number one, intensive for me means that you're putting in a lot of hours, more hours than, the average person is putting in. Intensive could mean a couple hours a day. Intensive, even that's pretty intensive. If you did 2 hours a day of study, even that's reasonably intensive, right? 3 hours a day, 2 hours a day, 4, like that's pretty intensive in my books. What is that noise? Oh, there's an airplane outside. Anyway, I just hear an airplane flying. It distracted me. So for me, when I was referencing intensive study, for me personally, what it usually means is that I have traveled abroad to another country and I'm taking some classes there in that country for the target language. And I am also doing activities on a day-to-day basis that force me to apply the knowledge that I've learned. So for example, my intensive studies in Taiwan were living with a Taiwanese family that spoke Mandarin. That was their language they spoke, just like everyone in Taiwan or most people in Taiwan. So that was a daily usage of Mandarin and exposure of Mandarin. I was taking 2 hours a day of classes, which again was a daily Mandarin work that I would do. I would go to Mandarin meetups and different events where I would practice Mandarin and speak Mandarin. Obviously, everything around me was in Mandarin. The signs, when I took taxis, the train, like a lot of stuff around me was in Mandarin. So most of my days, in Taiwan, I spoke a minimal amount of English on a day-to-day basis. Maybe out of my 16 waking hours or 16 to 17 waking hours, I probably spoke 2 to 3 hours of English. Maybe 4 hours of English, probably that even sounds like a lot, like maybe 3 hours of English, let's say, and the rest was in Mandarin. So that was what I was referring to when it came to my personal intensive study. So we got another comment in the chat. How are you, bro? I am doing good, bro. Hope you are doing good too. Not sure why the Indian accent came out, but it did. Okay, I have one more question I want to talk about here, which is actually the title of the video, unless I choose to change the title of the video. Let me find it here. All right, I found the question. This question comes from Bella So again, on Instagram, Bella, and then last name is Baragi. So Baragi. So Bella asks, I shall read this out. Hey, Azren, I hope you're doing well. I don't think you've ever addressed this issue before, so I'd like to ask you, do you have any specifics, any system in particular for learning Chinese characters? Do you just write the characters over and over until it sticks? Do you put posters on your walls? Like, what do you do? Cheers from Korea. I'm going to answer this question in a little bit of a more of a global sense. I think for remembering characters, it is a similar, remembering characters, being able to remember characters is the same question or an extremely similar question as to remembering vocabulary in a new language. So I'm going to address it more as a vocabulary question, not just Chinese characters. So basically, when it comes to remembering vocabulary, we have to think of it in two camps. First of all, there's remembering vocabulary in a spoken and listening sense. And then there's vocabulary in a written and a reading sense. So let's start on the spoken and listening side. And actually, to back up a step, essentially the same principles apply for both reading, writing, and speaking, listening. Same principles. Number one, you're going to need a lot of exposure to those new words. One common misconception for among language learners is that when you learn a new word, when a teacher teaches you or you come across it, after you see it once or twice or three times, you're going to remember. That's false. For sometimes you might hear a word, learn a word, and boom, it sticks immediately. But often, that's not how it's going to be. Often, you're going to have to get many different exposures to that word. You're going to have to hear it many times, read it many times, use it many times until finally it sticks in your brain. So I think one of the things for new vocabulary is repetition. I have a quick little story for you here. There's a word, I shared this on my podcast today, by the way. There's a word in Mandarin. There's a way to say like a pace of life in Mandarin. I learned it about 2 months ago. The number of times I tried to remember how to say that word or that phrase was crazy. Probably 3 or 4 times. I had to go back to my notes and be like, how do I say that again? And look at my notes again. And I was like, oh yeah, that word, right. So I needed a lot of repetition before it stuck. And to be honest, really before it actually stuck, the big thing that actually made it stick in my mind was having to use it in a real life situation. This literally happened 2 days ago. I did not remember the word, the way to say a pace of life in Mandarin until literally 2 days ago. Now it's automatically in my brain. What happened was I was at a pub night, a language learners pub night that I organize once a month. I was with some Mandarin speakers and learners. And I, before going to the event, told myself, I picked out a few different words and phrases before going to the event that I was like, I'm going to look for opportunities to use these words because I need them to stick. If I don't use them, they're not going to stick. So pace of life was one of these words, right? In Mandarin, it's 生活节奏. Okay, 生活节奏. That's how you say it. So I got to this event and there's a great opportunity to use this word. Someone was talking about their experience of living in China. And I was like, oh, this is a great time to ask them, what's the pace of life like in China? How did you think of it? Did you like it? Did you not? What was it like? How is it in comparison to Calgary? Blah, 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 blah. Okay. So the crazy thing is, even though I'd studied this word before, like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours before the event, I still didn't fully remember it at the event. I was like, I kind of remember it, but not really. I had to look it up again, probably the 5th time or 4th time, something like that I had to look the word up in the past 2 months. Then I used it. I looked it up, like I literally like snuck it. I didn't want people to see what I was doing. So I was like hiding, looked it up, and I was like, oh yeah, that word. And then I asked the question. And I was like, hey, what did you think of I tried to say it as intelligently as possible. I was like, oh yeah, so what did you think of like the pace of life in China? Like, how was that in comparison to Calgary? I tried to say it super fluently as if I hadn't just looked it up. But ever since that, it's now stuck in my mind because, number one, I had lots of exposure to this word. I've read it so many times. I've forgotten it so many times. I've re-looked it up so many times. And then to really lock it in my memory, I had to actually use it in a real life situation. It wasn't until I used it that finally my brain's like, okay, I got this now. So it's a lot of that exposure that often is what's going to help you remember a word or any new word or grammar point or whatever. For written and reading purposes, especially on the character side, right? It's one thing to be able to remember how a word sounds or how to say it. It's another word to remember it when you see it or to remember how to write it. Two different skills, and yet the same concepts apply. You need a lot of exposure to that word. You have to read it. You have to read your notes again. You have to come across it in real life situations. And you have to use that word in real life situations as well. So the most recent real life example for me is what do you call it? Traditional characters in Chinese, in Mandarin. So Mandarin has two different writing systems, depending on if you're in mainland China or if you're, say, in Taiwan. Mainland China uses simplified characters. Taiwan uses traditional characters. When I was learning Mandarin, it was difficult for me at first because, one of the things that was difficult was anytime I saw traditional characters, I was lost. And that's very normal for Mandarin learners because traditional characters do look reasonably different than simplified. Okay. Now, I was in Taiwan for 5 weeks. They use traditional characters. I've never studied traditional characters. So what do? Well, I had to learn them, right? Because I was there. So the way I learned it was I downloaded a traditional character keyboard on my phone. And that's what I started to use. And every time I texted people, I forced myself to use traditional characters. And I would look up, anytime I was typing, I was like, is that the right character? I would look up that character in a dictionary. I would look that up. And then people would respond to my text messages, friends and teachers and such. And then often I wouldn't be able to read what they said at first because they use traditional characters, not simplified. I would then look up those characters and be like, oh, I understood. So by using those traditional characters on a regular basis, after 2 or so weeks, I got quite comfortable using those characters and remembering those characters. So often I find it's just that application. The application is often what will help things really stick in your mind. So Tessa has commented again. So practically, going back to what I was saying before about intensive study, she said, so practically you did a complete switch. Love it. Thank you. I put in many hours, but I wouldn't consider them intensive at the moment. I'm fine with the 5-year learn. Yep. And even me, with some intensive study, it's still taking me 5 years. And I think that's okay. I don't think it's bad, right? Some people do learn faster than me. There's no doubt. I don't think I'm the fastest language learner, but I don't need to be the fastest language learner per se. That doesn't, I think often when you move really fast with language learning, when you move really, really quickly, what can happen is you might cut some corners, which, by the way, is not bad to cut corners. It's not. It just means that when you speak, you might make a lot more mistakes than what I feel comfortable doing. I want to speak properly as I can. I don't want to have a lot of mistakes. I don't want to have a lot of grammar mistakes or pronunciation mistakes. I want to sound proper. And so for me, the way that I know how to do that is to move at a reasonably slow pace, slow but consistent. So one random thing I'll say to finish this podcast off, just a personal note, I suppose, is actually, you know what? Yeah, why not? Let's share it and we'll get it out there and then we'll finish this episode here. So a personal note. So an interesting thing when I'm in Canada, in Calgary here, which is where I live, in Canada, historically, in my adult years, I've had more of a sedentary lifestyle. So sedentary lifestyle, for those of you who don't know what it means, basically what it means is that you spend a lot of time sitting down, right? You're not very active. In my adult years, that has been a thing because I'm sitting on my laptop. My work is sitting down work. My work is just very sitting oriented. And so I sit a fair amount, and which is not healthy, obviously. It's not a healthy thing to be doing. And being more active is something I've tried. I've struggled with, actually. I've struggled to be more active. I've really struggled to be more active, to be honest. It's something that I'll be really good for a few weeks or a month, then I'm bad for a while. And I fall back into old habits. I've recently had a bit of a breakthrough. I've had an active lifestyle now for, a little bit over 2 months, as I'm thinking about it, a little bit more than 2 months. And I wanted to share kind of what the breakthrough was for me. The breakthrough for me was a complete change of environment and having no choice but to be more active. When I was traveling for 2 months. I had no car, meaning I had to get around using public transportation, a lot of walking, and a lot of bikes, public bicycles, right? Because they have public bicycles in France and in what do you call it? And in Taiwan. So for 2 months, like I had to be more active by design. I lived a 15-minute walk from the train station. You know, even on the trains, like there's walking that I had to do to get to school and different restaurants I like to eat at. Like there's no choice. France, similar kind of thing. So what happened was for 2 months, I was very active. When I came back to Canada, suddenly it was a habit to be more active. And it felt weird going back to my old habits of being very sedentary. So now, even though I'm back in Canada, I have a car and everything, I'm still maintaining a very active lifestyle because it has now become a habit, essentially. So just a random thing. I think you're changing your environment. When you change your physical environment, I think the human brain gets very confused because we don't have habits for that new environment, which means it's very easy to set new habits for that particular environment. And so, yeah, it's just an interesting little fact I was thinking about today. Imran asks, can you please tell me what is the meaning of the word get? So get, here's actually a trick for the word get in English. The word get in English does not translate very well into other languages, in my experience. Usually, get will have many different meanings in other languages. So, the way to approach the word get is to understand that. How do I explain this? Even though it's only one word, get is really more like 20 words. The amount of time it'll take to understand the word get is the same amount of time it would take you to learn 20 new verbs, because we use the get very flexibly and we use it for many different things. So when you're studying that word get, you have to be patient and you have to learn one meaning at a time. There's many meanings of get. Get could mean purchase, like to buy something. Get can mean to receive, like to receive a gift. Get can mean if you get lost, meaning you don't know where you are and you're trying to find out where you are. Get can be used to say get lost, as in go away. Get can be like so many things. It's used in a lot of phrasal verbs, like get up, which is like if you're laying down to like get up, to stand up. It's very similar. So there's a lot of meanings to it, but the easiest way to understand the word get is you have to learn each individual meaning and how to use it. And it might take you a few months of practice and consistent work until you finally understand all or many of the different usages of the word get. So thank you everyone for watching this. This is slightly longer than usual, but that's okay. Have a good rest of your Monday or whatever day it is as you're watching this, and we will talk very, very soon. Bye for now. See you.